Welcome to Go for Side Effects. I am your host, Kevin Simon. Y'all know my co-host, good looking John. John, how you doing today, buddy?
Doing good, thanks.
And my other kind of good looking co-host. Wait, how you doing, bud?
Man, I am excited for tonight. I am doing fabulous. Thank you, man.
And we have Dr. Golomb that is on the phone with us right now, and we are going to dive in with her. And how are you doing tonight?
I am doing great. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, I'm so excited for you being on. And I want to thank everybody for going over and checking out our YouTube page and building that up. But I'm going to go ahead and we need to dive into this. However long this takes is however long this takes tonight. And so one of the reasons why is we kind of would like, because a lot of people are saying there's a lot of comparisons to East Palestine to Gulf War problems, Gulf War illness problems. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I think most of your audience knows about the Gulf War, where, the U.S. sent about 695 folks to the Middle East, and they were exposed to a lot of different things, everything from the PB or pyridostigmine bromide nerve gas pre-treatment pills to heavy use of pesticides, low-level nerve gas, oil fires. Some got ciprofloxacin for biological warfare protection, chemical agent resistant compound paint, depleted uranium, anthrax vaccine, botulinum toxoid vaccine, a lot of different vaccines. And so lots of exposures, but different personnel had different subsets of those exposures. Not everybody got exactly the same stuff. And yet this characteristic illness developed that we now call Gulf War illness. Our data showed that no matter what the exact chemicals people were exposed to, the severity of that Gulf War illness is tied to the severity of the cell energy impairment, the impairment of the mitochondria, the function of the energy powerhouses of cells. Well, that's really interesting because almost every chemical produces damage to those cell energy powerhouses as part of their toxicity, no matter what their chemical class is. And so that means that in other settings, if there's a lot of different low-level chemicals, even if every chemical is at a safe level individually, that damage to those cell energy powerhouses will add up across the chemicals or synergize, meaning be more than additive. So that damage can easily surpass the point where it leads to clinical problems, the amount of damage to cell energy where people start suffering from it. So when we heard about the East Palestine derailment, we thought, well, here's another setting where supposedly the chemicals were all within individually safe levels, but a lot of people are reporting health problems. And we thought, gee, if this turned out to be this mechanism for Gulf War veterans, then we would expect the same problem would occur with this other set of very varied chemicals, even though they're mostly different chemicals. It was stuff like vinyl chloride and butyl acrylate and benzene, toluene. Actually, there are some that are relevant to the Gulf War, like aqueous firefighting foam, which we heard that the 180th were exposed to.
Yep. Hey, Dr. Golomb, just so we don't get too far into this, can you, for those, can you explain what you're referencing when you're saying East Palestine, so everybody's on the same sheet of music, and specifically what you're talking about?
Yeah, there's an area in Appalachia. Thank you for bringing me back to the baseline of this. There's an area in Appalachia in Ohio near the Pennsylvania border where a train derailed and 11 of the cars were carrying toxic chemicals, multiple different toxic chemicals. And those chemicals were released during the derailment. And then after that was on February 3rd, 2023. And on February 6th, they did a, quote, controlled burn where they burned a lot of the chemicals, kind of like burn pits for Gulf War and other veterans, where multiple different toxic chemicals were burned together. And when you burn chemicals, that creates a lot of new toxic chemicals. And it also, expands the spread because the plume and the wind carry those chemicals so more people get exposed. And a bunch of the people in this pretty rural area called East Palestine and the surrounding areas began reporting health problems. Initially, these were not Gulf classic health problems. A lot of bloody nose, eye irritation, throat irritation, nose irritation. Um, but then, we also began hearing the stuff like sinus congestion, which is actually pretty common in Gulf War veterans, headaches, fatigue problems, etc. So we kind of felt like it was playing out the same way it played out in the Gulf War, where everybody's saying, well, all the levels are supposedly safe, so there can't really be a problem. Well, if a lot of people are reporting symptoms, there's a problem. And the fact that you think that every chemical is within safe limits, that's not a guarantee of anything because you haven't tested every chemical. You don't even know how to test every chemical. You don't know every chemical that was produced in that burn. And you certainly haven't tested every chemical at every point in time and every place. And on top of that, even if you think those chemicals are at safe levels, you don't really know that because most of those chemicals have never undergone any serious human safety tests. The only chemicals that usually undergo serious human safety tests are the chemicals that we call drugs. And even for them, they go through animal tests and then they go through human tests and then they're released to the open market. And then a third of them end up getting withdrawn or have black box warnings or some other regulatory action that arises because it turns out they have problems that had not been figured out, even with that formal testing, that most of these chemicals will never have had in the first place. So we didn't buy the fact that everything is fine. People are reporting health problems. Everything is not fine. Just like in the Gulf War, where we were told everything is fine, it's all in their head. We heard the same thing in East Palestine. So we thought, okay, well, maybe we can take the lessons that we've learned from Gulf War illness and jumpstart our understanding of what's going on in East Palestine. And really, initially, we didn't have any idea. Maybe it would be a flash in the pan. Maybe people would get sick and then get better. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. Unfortunately, what happened is a lot of people got chronic health problems. And our early data, and I will say this is all provisional, it has not been published yet, but our early data show that the health pattern for the chronic health symptoms meets the Kansas, the more specific Gulf War illness definition. And what specific means is it means like the fewest people that were not in the Gulf War met that criteria. Like there's the CDC criteria that to say if you have any symptom of any severity in at least two of the three areas of fatigue, musculoskeletal, and mood cognitive, that's enough to have Gulf War illness. Well, a lot of people that were never deployed to the Gulf will meet that criteria. But the Kansas criteria are a lot more specific. They're a lot harder to meet those criteria. But still, in our initial survey, granted it was mostly people that were close in, within 50% were within 1.2 miles of the derailment. And the people, of course, who became ill are more likely to choose to participate in the study. But nonetheless, more than 70% met those Kansas symptom criteria for Gulf War illness.
That's a pretty good number, though, 70%.
Since we took people whether they were affected or not. It's a very high number, considering that, like in the original Kansas data, they found that for the people that weren't deployed to the Gulf, about 8% met them. And here we're seeing like 73%. And so then we began looking at, okay, well, what about some of the other, blood markers that are affected in Gulf War veterans? And so inflammation is elevated in Gulf War veterans. C-reactive protein or high sensitivity C-reactive protein is the main clinical marker of inflammation. And a lot of studies show that it's elevated on average in Gulf War veterans or higher in controls. It's still the minority of Gulf War veterans with Gulf War illness where the value is frankly elevated over the normal range. We found the same thing in East Palestine. And the first group that we tested, 8 of 26 people had frankly elevated levels. So that's a pretty sizable chunk, but it's still the minority, like with Gulf War illness. And then the really interesting thing is in Gulf War veterans, we found that even though inflammation is elevated, instead of the degree of elevation predicting more severe illness, it actually predicted higher inflammation predicted less severe illness in Gulf War veterans after you controlled for the mitochondrial problem. We think we know why that is, but that's a little bit of a longer story. our evidence actually now from both Gulf War and East Palestine ties that inflammation to something called programmed cell death, where the body kills off cells that are kind of too damaged, partly as an adaptive thing. And the analogy I would give is you have like a plum tree in your yard. If you've got last year's plums still sitting there that are, derelict and not, not good anymore, they're still on the tree, then they're using water, energy, nutrients, and robbing that from the new fruit. It's the same thing with cells. If they're sufficiently impaired, the body does better by clearing them away. And when you clear them away, that actually leads to inflammation and coagulation activation, both of which we know are increased in Gulf War veterans. And our data tie that inflammation to two biomarkers that are known to be drivers of that cell death. We see that both in East Palestine and in Gulf War veterans. And in East Palestine, like in Gulf War veterans, in that original group, the higher the inflammation, the less severe the illness, just like we saw in Gulf War veterans. A counterintuitive, paradoxical finding, but it's the same in East Palestine that we saw in Gulf War illness.
Okay, so with that also being said, that was going to be one of my questions is, so if I was exposed to like petroleum, like during Desert Storm with oil wildfires in the Gulf, and somebody was exposed to like sarin gas, it could, would that almost mimic the same thing when it comes to that?
Well, yeah, at least the chronic symptoms, the Kansas criteria are met in both groups. They're met in the people that got the oil fires, but they got a lot of other stuff too. And the people that got the sarin, but they got a lot of other stuff too. And usually they got pretty low levels of sarin, and that low level sarin plus the other low level exposures. Again, the thing that is in common across all those chemicals and that adds up, again, is at least in part, is that damage to those energy powerhouses. So so we see similar illness because, and if you think about like what are the top symptoms in Gulf War veterans, in fact, what are those CDC criteria? They're fatigue, musculoskeletal, and mood cognitive, which is basically muscle, brain, and fatigue. What are the top symptoms of cell energy impairment? Brain, muscle, and fatigue. Why is that? Well, first off, fatigue is low energy, so that kind of is almost obvious if you have the energy powerhouses. And then the other reason is that the brain and the muscle are highly energy demanding tissues. Like a lot of other tissues, like, they don't need high energy. The brain is the most energy demanding, which is why so many symptoms are brain related symptoms. Like 2% of the body weight is the brain approximately, but it uses half of the sugar in the whole body, the glucose, and it uses about a fifth to a fourth of all the oxygen. So the brain is very hungry for energy. And that means that when there's not enough energy, the brain is affected. And the analogy I give there is like, suppose there's a drought. Is it the avocado tree that needs a lot of water, produces lots of amazing fruit, but it needs a lot of water? Or there's the cactus that doesn't need a lot of water. Which one is hurt when there's not enough water? Well, the avocado tree is the one that gets hurt. And it's the same thing when there's not enough energy. The brain requires a lot of energy, whereas there may be some other organs that require a lot less energy. And so the brain, because its cells need the energy, when they don't get it, they die, just kind of like the avocado tree.
No, that's fair. That's fascinating. That's really fascinating. And I do know Wade. I know Wade actually has some questions, so I'm gonna let Wade take.
I just want to kind of actually repeat something that we went over last time that you were on, and we didn't get to finish a couple of them, but I think, in my opinion, I think it's important for us to repeat it. But like we discussed, so let's say you took a muscle biopsy from myself, John, and Kevin, and you determined that all three of us have a mitochondrial dysfunction in our cells.
Okay.
So, but can you tell us, distinctively that muscle, that dysfunction is due to exposures we experienced in the Gulf?
No.
Okay. I think that's very.
There might be a way, like if we had good enough exposure data, which is kind of hard to be sure of this far out after the Gulf,
Right.
then we could look to see whether the pattern of exposures related to the pattern of mitochondrial problems. We have not done that. We really, like muscle biopsies are invasive. You need a lot of people to be able to see, okay, which pattern of exposures is tied, is it any pattern of exposures that's tied to that, or is it, but yeah, the severity of the illness in Gulf War veterans is clearly tied to a particular defect in the mitochondria. Now, interestingly, we've just started looking at the subset of veterans, which is around half the ones that have Gulf War illness, at least in our studies, that also report being sensitive to chemicals after the Gulf. And there's a different mitochondrial problem that looks like it's tied to that. We'll talk about that more some other time, but we're really starting to look more at that whole phenomenon of why are some veterans chemically sensitive. We've heard some veterans tell us, like, before the Gulf, I love the smell of gasoline. I would practically bathe in it. I would feel great. Now I can't be anywhere near it. The smell really bothers me. Alcohol really bothers me. Every medicine they try to put me on really makes me worse. So we're now getting good data from mitochondrial, the muscle biopsy data, and also membrane data that also that are also telling us about that. And by the way, same in East Palestine. About half the people that meet the cancer criteria also report being newly chemically sensitive after the East Palestine derailment. And there too, we have data, not exactly the same data, because in Gulf War veterans, we've done muscle biopsies and we've done skin biopsies. We didn't have anywhere near the funding to do that, but we were able to get a blood draw using a mobile phlebotomy company on a number of people there, and look at the membranes of the red blood cells using a commercial company that looks at the pattern of fats in the membrane. And so both Gulf War veterans and folks in East Palestine also show very altered membranes, and the degree of alteration is tied to the degree of illness. And there again, we see a bit of a different pattern in the people that become really chemically sensitive. They've got an additional sort of set of problems in their membranes and in their mitochondria.
Okay.
So and Dr. Golomb, I don't think that I don't think that something happened, but I'm one, and I'm not a doubter, but I am an antagonist when it comes to the whole issue.
Good. I love antagonists.
So I'm going to ask this question to Kevin and John, and the people are viewing, and you're going to know where I'm going with this. So I'm going to read off a few signs and symptoms here and see if any of these sound familiar to anybody out there. Muscle aches and pains, cognitive issues, sexual dysfunction, gastro and neurological issues, depression, anxiety, my favorite, pancreatic issues, and mitochondrial dysfunction. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
Yeah.
Does that sound pretty
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Golomb, you know where I'm going with this.
I suspect.
Not only in Gulf War illness, but she's also an expert in what we call statin drugs. And so somebody who has been on a statin drug for a long period of time, the war's only been over 35 years, could be experiencing these same type of signs and symptoms. Not only is it that can cause these, but it's also what they refer to as a gateway drug. So you're having one sign and symptom, they're going to give you a drug to treat that sign and symptom, and it's a snowball effect. Now, so how exactly do you? And I got this from, and people are going to be like, "Oh, this guy." Like I said, I'm the antagonist, and I got this from Dr. Golomb from a 2-hour podcast today, from watching her podcast. So how do you differentiate between people, between their signs and symptoms?
Well, obviously, from the context and from the timing, right? And so with and by the way, it was our work on statins that led me to hypothesize that mitochondria were involved in Gulf War illness. Statins at the time that we were doing this work were the best-selling prescription drugs in the United States, and the number 1 and number 2 drugs were the 2 that we tested in a randomized controlled trial. And there was evidence that there was mitochondrial impairment, but you weren't really allowed to say it because there were billions of dollars on the line and a lot of money going to say, don't you dare say anything bad.
But
the most common symptom, the most common symptoms in a survey that we did were fatigue, muscle, and cognitive. And then there are all these subsidiary symptoms like you see in the Gulf War, people that report, neuropathy type symptoms, people that report, pretty much everything that you see in the Gulf will appear in a subset. Irritability, sleep apnea, all of those things are tied to the cell energy impairment. And so we couldn't get anyone that wanted to pay attention to this in the statin arena because of the, money influences. That we realized, wow, gee, what a coincidence that these 2 completely unrelated things that we're studying seem to have a similar symptom profile. Now, a difference is that if you go off statins, usually the problems get much better. Whereas for Gulf War veterans, they have, exposure to drugs that lead to persistent mitochondrial injury. With statins, a big piece of it is that statins depress the levels of coenzyme Q10 because they block the pathway that makes coenzyme Q10. And then on top of that, cholesterol is what transports coenzyme Q10 to tissues throughout the body. But that recovers when you go off the statins, whereas the mechanism of mitochondrial problems produced in Gulf War veterans doesn't equally recover. So with statins, what tells you that it's the statin is the timing, like, gee, this starts in a lot of people within, for some people within a day, but typically within 1 to 2 months of starting the statin, and it typically goes away or markedly abates when they stop the statin. And, we had one poor woman whose cognitive function was so impaired that her daughter, she was like in her early 60s, that her daughter wouldn't let her babysit her 9-year-old granddaughter, which is pretty old to not be allowed to babysit. And she contacted me and said, could this be the statins? And I said, well, I don't know, but it could be. If I were you, I would get your doctor to do the trial off. She went off, got completely better, somehow allowed her doctor to push her into going back on, and then her cognitive problems. And she, by the way, when she was off, she was smart, sharp, quick, and, really great, went back on, cognitive problems again, off, fine again. She allowed her doctor put her back on him 6 times, and on the 7th time, she didn't recover.
Okay, so
statins will do the same thing, and the way it's the statin is that lots of other people have had the problem, that we know the mitochondrial mechanism is operating, and that people get it timed with when they took the statin, and it often co-occurs with other problems like fatigue and muscle. In the Gulf, the way you tie it to the Gulf is similar. Lots of people newly began to have all these problems, mostly when they were in their 20s, which is not an age where a lot of people have muscle pain and cognitive problems and fatigue, especially people that were chosen to be in the military because they were physically fit, healthy, healthy warriors. And so now a lot of people come back from this deployment and have this shared set of symptoms, and this unprecedented array of chemical exposures. And so that is for that group, the fact that you have the symptoms, that many other people got the symptoms, that the timing related to, followed Gulf participation. And now we have all this supportive evidence from mitochondrial studies, et cetera, that plexuses that.
Okay, well, I got a question now, and you're going to let John Wade, we've heard this. There's a lot of reports, and I hear more out of the Navy side and maybe the Marine side than I do the Army, but burning semen.
Yes.
So what could possibly cause that?
That's a really good question. to which I don't fully know the answer. We did ask that in East Palestine, and we also heard some positives on that. And remind me to also talk about the broken teeth that a lot of Gulf War veterans talked about, because that's something else we heard a lot in East Palestine. But my best guess would be there's a couple of phenomena that happen when you pair a chemical, including a chemical in the body, with an oxidative stressor, like a chemical that promotes this type of injury that we call oxidative stress. It's that type of damage that antioxidants help protect against. Then you can mount an immune reaction against it. And my recollection is that there was a study on burning semen that found that a lot of it involved antibodies against compounds in the semen. And again, like the reason in my childhood, nobody had a peanut allergy. And then by the time I was in my, I don't want to say how old, but it's like everybody had peanut allergies. And why is that? What changed? Well, one thing that changed was that there was a considerable time when in every process, pretty much every processed food, they put peanut products in and tied it with other chemicals that serve as oxidative stressors. And now you're pairing that quote antigen, the peanut protein, with an oxidative stressor, and that helps the body mount an immune reaction against it.
Oh,
So
yeah.
just like everybody got peanut allergies, a thing that can happen is that you now have these nasty chemicals that are oxidative stressors floating around in the body, and you have this exposure to this, seminal fluid, and antibodies can be mounted against that as well. In fairness, I'm not sure that that's the only mechanism, and this is based on recollection of a study that I need to go back and double check. But I believe that at least some of it was shown to be antibodies against seminal fluid components, which makes total sense, honestly.
Makes sense. All right, Wade, you're up.
No, I just want the one thing I just wanted to go back and just to let Dr. Golomb know is it was because of her that I actually looked into the whole statin thing that I'd been on since I was 40 years old. And then, after doing American University's diet study, and then over the past year and a half, between diet, light exercise, nothing strenuous, trust me, but I've been able to eliminate statins, out of my medicine regimen. I've eliminated blood pressure pill, and I think I've been 6 months now off of the statins. Can I tell you the difference or not? But my cholesterol is still very well. It's great,
That's fantastic.
And it's, diet and activity, controlled. So it can be controlled. My point to that, and that's what I wanted to point out, was that as we're getting older, things are happening, things are bruising, things are hurting. I want a lot of veterans to realize just because they have a medical condition, it doesn't necessarily relate back to 35 years ago. And that's true. I see that a lot.
True.
I think it's very frustrating. I mean, it's not really frustrating for me because I deal with my own things. I just go on my own way. But I'm saying it can be very frustrating to the veteran themselves. And so I guess what I want to ask you now is, I know you have your study going on, but which I know we want to talk about. But a lot of people are wondering, for those that are at home today, what kind of advice can you give to them? What things can they do in their everyday life to help with the signs and symptoms that you would recommend?
Right. Well, one is remember to breathe, which turns out to be much more important than people appreciate. I'm serious.
Right. No, I agree.
If you find yourself being stressed or anxious, then breathe slowly and deeply. And again, oxygen, it's like a 15-fold multiplier in how much energy your cells make for every sugar molecule. So it's massively important for cell energy, which makes it massively important for Gulf War veterans. And that also means that if you have any possibility of having sleep apnea, you should get tested for it, because mitochondrial impairment promotes sleep apnea. And it does that because it weakens muscles, including the muscles that hold open the airway. And that means those muscles are more prone to relatively collapse when you are lying down. And then that leads less oxygen to come in, and Gulf War veterans are going to have more problems tolerating even small drops in oxygen because of that mitochondrial impairment. Like, you're already not getting enough cell energy, and then you're cutting this thing that is a major multiplier in how much energy you produce. So that is like a very, very, very major thing that, again, in all of these conditions, we also are seeing really high rates of new onset sleep apnea symptoms in East Palestine. And that is basically an amplifier of chemical injury in multiple different ways. So first off, there's the cell energy damage from the chemicals, and then you're compounding it with the cell energy damage from the episodes of dropped oxygen at night. Second off, there's a phenomenon called reoxygenation injury, that when that oxygen level comes back up, it produces more of that nasty free radical oxidative stress. And that actually is competing with the oxidative stress from the chemicals and from the mitochondrial damage caused by the chemicals. And so it's worsening that aspect of chemical injury as well. And then sleep apnea is also interrupting sleep at night, and that leads to a drop in the levels of melatonin. And people think of melatonin as for sleep, but it turns out that melatonin is actually one of the most important antioxidants in the body. It not only is what's called a, quote, free radical scavenger, meaning that it's busy sopping up those nasty free radicals on its own, but it also is involved in upregulating the master antioxidant pathways that lead to all the other antioxidants. So if you get a drop in melatonin, you are losing important antioxidant protections. On top of that, that cell energy impairment drives what's called sympathetic activity, meaning like adrenaline and noradrenaline. And not only does that lead to anxiety, which is one of the reasons why anxiety is tied to sleep apnea and every other thing that causes cell energy impairment, but it also means that the normal waste clearance from the brain is impeded. There's like a lymphatic system that's kind of like the blood system, except it's not blood. It's something else called lymph. And at night, that's responsible for clearing waste products from the brain. That's why you always hear that, like, oh, you need sleep for brain detoxification. That sympathetic arousal that happens because of the inadequate cell energy, that also contributes to anxiety. It also, like, impairs your ability to clear waste products from the brain. So there are these multiple different ways where sleep apnea is actually worsening the consequences of the chemical injury. So it has often a really outsized impact when you treat it after any mitochondrial toxin. So Gulf War, presumably East Palestine, fluoroquinolone toxicity, a lot of these different settings where people have, a toxic drug or chemical combination that impairs cell energy. Treating the sleep apnea can be one of the biggest factors to helping recovery. So that's the oxygen at night. And I also mentioned breathing during the day. So those are two big factors. Another thing you alluded to is diet, and having a clean diet is really helpful because your cells are already in trouble from the chemicals they've been exposed to. And we already mentioned that pretty much every chemical produces mitochondrial toxicity as part of its profile. That includes all the chemicals that are stuffed into processed foods. So, like, reducing processed foods and having clean, real foods. I kind of refer to things that we put in our mouths and eat as foods and anti-foods. The foods are the things that provide your cells with the nutrition, the nutrients, and the antioxidants that your cells need to survive and thrive. And the anti-foods are the things that body, and they may taste good and they may give you calories, but they are also giving you pro-oxidants and not the nutrients that your cells need. So a clean diet can often make a much bigger difference than people appreciate. So those would be, big things. Of course, we're also testing, again, whether, as in our earlier study, whether coenzyme Q10 as a supplement leads to benefit. In our small study, it benefited both symptoms and function. And there are other studies showing that many of the adverse outcomes that are elevated in Gulf War veterans, everything from hypertension to heart disease to heart failure, those all have randomized trials showing that CoQ10 protects against them as well. Migraines. So right now we're like redoing a trial of CoQ10 in a larger sample, hoping to get actual FDA approval so that veterans could actually get the CoQ10 paid for if the benefit that we saw in the earlier study shows up again.
Ooh,
So anybody that's listening to this call,
I like that, and I really do. John, do you have any questions?
Oh, no, I've just been listening. No, I'm good.
Okay, so my next question will be, okay, so as you were talking about, many different exposures can pretty much lead up to messing with the mitochondria. Okay,
Yeah.
so my other thing is what about the veterans who didn't deploy? And what about the veterans that when it hit in their 40s, they started having these problems? So the two separate questions here, but kind of the same is one didn't deploy, one wasn't out there, but they did get vaccines. The other one is some vets haven't experienced anything about Gulf War illness, and some people have it didn't hit them till like their mid 40s.
Right.
Does that happen? I'm just wondering.
I think the answer is yes. And the reason I think that is from people that have inherited mitochondrial problems, where the same family, it's called a kindred, a family that shares the same mitochondrial impairment. And this was one of the other things, by the way, that made me think that Gulf War illness was mitochondrial, is there's this phenomenon of variable latency, meaning time delay to symptom onset. It's a well-known characteristic of mitochondrial problems. And I think there's doesn't really matter the name of the author, but I think it's Crimmins that talks about one kindred or family where a certain neurological problem happened in one member of the family when they're like 3 and someone else when they're like 60. Again, like a classic mitochondrial problem that shows up at different time points in different people. And why is that? And in one of the early Gulf War studies, they said, 40% of these elevated symptoms first arise over a year after the Gulf. And that's before we even have looked out many, many years after the Gulf. So we don't have good data for the people that we don't have good data, for symptom onset 10 years out and what fraction of that is Gulf related and what fraction isn't. But because when you get mitochondrial injury, it begets more free radicals. They're produced by the damaged mitochondria. And then that in turn can lead to more mitochondrial injury. And so over time, that can build up until the point where it's accelerating pretty quickly. And in fact, that's what a lot of aging is that once you get into older age, enough of that mitochondrial damage has happened that it begins being self-reinforcing at a faster pace. And that's why a lot of people have, and we noticed very early as well, to a large extent, Gulf War illness looks like early aging. You've got weaker muscles, you've got more pain, you've got more cognitive problems, you've got, more of a lot of different things that happen at a high rate with aging. And then all the elevated problems like higher hypertension and heart disease and heart failure, those are all classically age-related problems that showed up in younger age. That's in part because this mitochondrial process, in aging, that level of injury that leads to that sort of self-reinforcing acceleration is happening later in age. Well, it's been prompted to happen earlier because there's more chemicals that led the mitochondria to be damaged at a younger age.
Oh.
So that's why it is probably the case that even if people are experiencing problems for the first time 35 years out, some of those might have been present in that person and not somebody else because of their Gulf exposure. It's hard to know.
Right, but
have formal studies, but some of it can absolutely be Gulf promoted.
Oh, I like that. And Jared, I'm going to get to a question. Somebody asked this. And I want to get to Jared's question. He said, are we going to ask her about Asia? Autoimmune syndrome introduced by.
adjuvants.
Yep.
Yep. So I will admit that I did a report in the 1990s for an entity that shall be nameless on vaccines and Gulf War illness. And it was sent to scientific peer review, including people like Donald Henderson, who developed the smallpox vaccine. And it failed to scientific review, and then it was sent to stakeholder review, FDA, CDC, DOD, VA, et cetera, where they didn't like it. They didn't like what it had to say.
Well, and here it also says that, and it says why anti-squalene antibodies test became unavailable.
Well, so the anti-squalene antibody issue is an interesting and separate issue. I am not persuaded that anti-squalene antibodies are particularly themselves important. We all have squalene on our skin. It gets introduced as a contaminant into many different vaccines. But what happens in Gulf War illness is that there's higher rates of a lot of different autoantibodies. And the first paper that showed that was the one by Vojdani, who tested this Array 5 autoimmune reactivity panel that's sold by this company called Cyrex. And he showed that, multiple different autoantibodies were elevated. And we expect that because oxidative stress drives increased autoimmunity. Same thing with the burning semen syndrome and the seminal fluid autoantibodies. You get autoantibodies to a lot of other things in your body because you've got these oxidative stressors, and they modify, super fancy term, but I won't even give the term. They modify substances in the body like proteins and lipids and so forth in a way that makes them more vulnerable to being attacked by the immune system.
No, that makes sense.
Antibodies might just be yet another antibody that's elevated. It doesn't have to mean that squalene was used as an adjuvant, but adjuvants were used in vaccines and are significantly a significant possibility as a factor because they're used specifically for the purpose of driving immune reactivity. And the body doesn't necessarily know that the aluminum product that you put into the vaccine for the purpose of magnifying the response, the reaction to the anthrax toxin proteins, it doesn't necessarily know that that aluminum is only supposed to be tied to the anthrax toxin proteins, and it may lead your body to have an autoimmune reaction to something else as well.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a whole lot of sense. Wade?
Another question that we had from one of the viewers was, have you noticed or on your labs any commonality of low zinc or vitamin D? I think that vitamin D seems to be a commonality, but with low zinc.
Yeah, so I can't comment on the zinc issue, but I began measuring vitamin D in every patient back about a decade before anyone else started looking at vitamin D. And in fact, I got a call from the head of the lab at the VA saying, gee, I noticed you're testing vitamin D in all your patients and they're all low. And what most people don't know is that oxidative stress itself depresses levels of vitamin D. And so it's not necessarily the case that you have low vitamin D and that led to your problems, although low vitamin D is tied to many problems because basically oxidative stress causes both the low vitamin D and the many problems, but it's also tied causally to some problems. And the only way you can really know that is to see whether giving vitamin D supplements helps to reduce those problems. A lot of the claims about vitamin D are because it's associated with a zillion problems because it's a shared low vitamin D is a shared outcome of oxidative stress with everything else. So I think, for example, there's a paper on depleted uranium in rats showing that it depresses levels of vitamin D. So yes, vitamin D will very, very often be low in Gulf War veterans, and in fact, I found in a great many of my veteran patients, period, probably in part because. And there were even studies showing that, like, there were some Hawaiian surfers that had low levels of vitamin D. Even all that sunshine didn't totally protect you. So yes, vitamin D is low. I will say this is hot off the press, and don't make too much of it. But we're just getting back some genetic data from Gulf War veterans literally today. And one of the genes that showed up as maybe having some mutations that look like it might be tied to Gulf War illness severity, but we have to do a lot more analysis, is actually the vitamin D receptor. So vitamin D, is involved in a lot of things, especially muscle strength, and in some studies, but not others, pain protection. Vitamin D, by the way, is made, guess where? It's made in the mitochondria. It is actually a steroid hormone made from cholesterol, like every other steroid hormone, all of which are produced in the mitochondria. And so, whether that mitochondrial connection is important here or not, I don't fully understand. Also, I will mention that vitamin D travels in association with cholesterol in the blood. Supposedly, it has its own transporter protein, but it travels with cholesterol, kind of like it's transported with cholesterol, and it's actually taken up into cells by the LDL receptor. That's how it gets into your cells. And so, people think, oh, LDL cholesterol, evil, evil, evil. But LDL cholesterol is important in antioxidant transport, and actually is even disproportionately important for some antioxidants. So cholesterol transports carotenoids, the precursor for vitamin A. It transports vitamin E. It transports coenzyme Q10. CoQ10 is pretty much equally transported on every type of cholesterol, but some of them, and I'd have to look up now if it's carotenoids or vitamin E, that actually LDL selectively is important for that. And again, the LDL receptor is what takes up vitamin D into cells. So it may turn out like it may turn out that vitamin D has an important place. Again, it's definitely involved in a lot of things that we care about. It's produced in mitochondria, but the low levels we expect just because everybody was exposed to oxidative stressors and it's producing more free radicals. The zinc thing, I'm not sure about. I was not aware that a lot of veterans show low zinc levels.
I don't know if it's veteran wide. It was just a specific question, and it isn't like both zinc and vitamin D. You need both of those for males. You need that for proper sexual health. Is that correct?
I assume that's correct because you do practically everything. I'd have to look up the zinc issue. Zinc does have kind of a low toxic therapeutic ratio. Like you do have to be careful not to take too much of it.
Right.
But yeah, I'm not an expert on zinc and sexual function, so I'd have to look that up.
All right, let's get to that. Let's get to that next question. I know you have, Wade.
Well, so you said in your research, you are close to having biomarkers.
Well, we do have biomarkers, but they're not readily available biomarkers is the problem.
Right. That's so really we're still flying by the seat of our pants as far as if there is no like quote unquote diagnosis of Gulf War illness, Gulf War syndrome, whatever.
There's a symptom-based diagnosis, and we've accepted that for a lot of other problems. So it's basically like, were you deployed in the right time, and do you have the compatible profile of symptoms? It's not just enough to have one symptom. Like the cancer criteria require that you have, symptoms and at least 3 of the 6 domains of, pain, neurological, including mood, cognitive, fatigue, sleep, gastrointestinal, respiratory, and skin, and that they have been present for at least 6 months, and that the symptoms in every one of those at least 3 domains are at least of moderate severity or multiple symptoms in the domain. There are some researchers that are starting to require moderate symptoms as Gulf War veterans are getting older, and it's more likely that you can get like a couple of mild symptoms just due to aging. But it is a symptom-based diagnosis, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay. So
yeah.
Okay, so now this is going to be my question. So if we ever get an ICD code for Gulf 4 illness,
Uh-huh.
okay, so I went into the doctor and I sat down and talked to her. I said, let's do a hypothetical, doc. And she said, okay. And she said, I said, what if we get an ICD code that says Gulf 4 syndrome, Gulf 4 side effects, which I just want to throw that in there, or Gulf 4 illness.
Yeah.
I said, just let me ask you this. Would I fall under that criteria? And she goes, absolutely not. And I said, why? And she said, because you already have diagnosis and you already know exactly, we know exactly what's going on with you as far where we were only treating the symptom, but we don't know what happened to you. We can't say if it was a vaccine. We can't say if it was, chemicals, petroleum, sarin gas, mustard. We don't know because y'all were exposed to so much. What would you say?
Yeah, what I would say to that is that's why our mitochondrial data are so important, because they show it doesn't really matter what the exact profile of symptoms was. The severity of Gulf 4 illness, using our UCC20 score to examine severity, no matter what the exposure was, the severity of that Gulf 4 illness in people that meet those Kansas criteria is determined by the severity of mitochondrial problems, and we know those mitochondrial problems are produced by all those chemicals. So it doesn't really matter which chemicals you had. If you meet the Kansas criteria, then the severity of that, the resulting illness, is tied to the severity of mitochondrial impairment, which is produced by all those chemicals. Now, can you test that mitochondrial impairment? No, but you don't have to, because we already have the Kansas diagnosis in which the severity is tied to mitochondrial impairment.
Okay. And so, and that's what, I just sat there, I just kind of rolled my eyes and I said, that's why they should call it Gulf 4 side effects. But why did they change the name for Gulf 4? Just real quick. Why did they change the name from? Yes.
It was the most stupid argument, where there were a group of enemies of the idea of Gulf 4 illness that were busy saying it can't be a syndrome because, and then making it, a semantic argument. And so then ultimately the other side, okay, well, if you don't want to call it a syndrome, we'll call it an illness. But I think, in the ICD code submission, we do have a synonym, Gulf 4 syndrome.
Right.
It's just a stupid, petty, semantic argument.
Okay, because I could see it more of a syndrome than I can an illness, because usually,
I agree with you.
Yeah, because an illness you normally have a treatment for. A syndrome you don't. And I got that off of WebMD, by the way.
What you read?
Yeah, I don't know that everybody would agree with that characterization of syndrome versus illness. But I don't have any problem with the term syndrome. But sort of the accepted term ultimately became Gulf 4 illness, but it was really because of a petty semantic argument.
Okay. All right. Wade, you got anything else?
No, I think we covered some stuff. Are we gonna ask Dr. Golomb to join us in the after show? Yes,
we will. We will definitely ask her to join us. John,
Okay.
do you have any questions?
I'm good.
All right. Well, man, thank y'all for joining us. I know we went a little bit longer. Y'all go check out our Patreon. Hey, and after show, it's going to be on Patreon. And that's where we dive a little bit deeper and ask a little bit more questions that probably Facebook wouldn't allow me to anyway. But I want to thank y'all for listening, and definitely we will see y'all next week. And if you need to get a hold of me, please get a hold of me at Kevin Simon at Gulf4sideeffects.com. And if y'all want to send me an email, this is how me and Dr. Golomb connect. And she's got some researchers that research that stuff that needs to be done by Gulf 4 vets. And so we're going to try to give her a hand with that. And she's going to send me the info.
Our email address?
Yes, give your email.
Okay, golomb@ucsd.edu, or if you're interested in the Q10 study at ucsd.edu. And you can also look up our website, although I think as of yesterday, we have to make sure we pay again, at golombresearchgroup.org.
Okay. And you will also send me we'll also send a link to where they can do that too.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And everything. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening, and we will be hitting after shows. Thank y'all very much.